All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Association Chat. Association Chat, which is your weekly online discussion for the association community where we warm ourselves by the virtual fire with topics of the day, welcoming thought leaders and trailblazers alike to join up in this online home for the community. I'm the host of Association Chat, Kiki L'Italien. And I just want to take a chance, a moment here to say thank you, thank you, thank you to all of the Patreon supporters of Association Chat. It takes many hours and lots of technology and sweat and tears and love to make it all come together. And because of the Association Chat Patreon patrons, it makes it all possible. So if you feel like showing your support, I will be sharing the link to become a Patreon patron throughout today's session. And with that, thank you. Now, I have a question for you. What is the one skill that makes everyone better? Well, our guest today is going to answer that question and many more. But I just want to ask you one more question before I invite him on. And that is, can you think about a time in your life when you tried to bring a group together and because of fighting and getting sidetracked, you found that your conversation was railroaded by disagreements or unrelated information, and it didn't go the way that you had planned? Can you think of an example like that? Because listen, living close to DC in an election year, I can tell you that I definitely can. The conversations and working together is how we get big things done. And that is why today we're talking with my dear friend and inspiration, Jeffrey Kufad. Jeffrey's well known in the association community after facilitating ASAE's Future Leaders Conference for 10 years, holding regional and national leadership positions with a variety of professional organizations, doing more than 100 conference keynotes and presentations, and having more than 20 feature articles in association publications, as well as being a columnist for PCMA's Convene magazine for almost a decade. And he's still looking fresh and ready to go into action.
I have examples. I
know. You have the receipts. Jeffrey, thank you for being here.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I'm thrilled to have a conversation with you today.
Oh, I am so glad. I am so glad. You know, I have been looking forward to this moment for a long time. I shared with the Patreon patrons a little bit earlier this week that I first reached out to you to join me on Association Chat years ago, and you were very polite, but you declined so that you could make room for other people in the industry, and you were stepping away from the spotlight. But you have decided that you would join me for today's interview, and I am so thankful because you have a purpose. You have a new purpose. And yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I know that you are very thoughtful about each and every engagement that you participate in. So I just really wanted to let you know that I recognize that, and I'm thankful. So that was very solemn, everyone. Okay, so what I've been asking people recently when I do these interviews is I've been saying, look, 2020, we're almost to the end of it, but 2020 started out, and who could see what was coming with a global pandemic and with all of the crazy, murder hornets, everything, you name it, happening in this year. And I'm imagining that 2020 did not start out the way, or did not end up the way that you thought it would when it started. So how has this year sort of impacted you?
Yeah, I always tell people when they ask that I'm doing better than most and probably not quite as good as some. So I'm in a pretty privileged position in that, I've worked from home for 20 plus years. I've lived on my own for 20 years. So particularly when we were in the lockdown phase earlier on, that wasn't a huge challenge for me to do that. It wasn't all that different from my normal routine, but I think on a professional level, what's been difficult, and obviously everyone's experienced this, is all the face-to-face work that was scheduled disappeared. And much of the way I do my work when it's at its best just doesn't really translate to a video medium. So I've done some virtual presentations, and I feel pretty good about the skill set that I bring to those. But having some engagements that you were already, in the planning for, and that you were really excited about the communities that you were engaged with, it took a little while to be like, bring those back. I want to do those again. Yeah, and so part of that time period of kind of reflection and what's going on was really thinking about, gosh, I am entering a phase of my life and my career that is probably my last professional work chapter. I'd been kind of winding down to more of a part-time status. And I thought, what is it that I'm really, really still passionate about? And where do I think I have a more unique contribution maybe to make to the association community in particular than some of my colleagues? And it really was around the topic of facilitation, and wiped out the brand of idea architects that I had built up over a decade plus, and said, facilitate better. And I think anytime that an ideal domain name is available, that's a sign from the gods that, like,
oh yeah, for sure.
yeah, you should do this. And so that's what I'm been unfolding and really getting ready to launch in 2021.
Well, and I just want to say, Amy she's watching live, and she says, "Hi, Jeffrey. I attended your FLF, your Future Leaders, and excited about your talk." So yeah. So, what's interesting is when I first encountered you, you were facilitating a group discussion that I was a part of, and it was so meaningful that basically from then on, I felt like I needed to stalk you. I just thought that you were fantastic. But, this is really something that facilitation is really something that people might add to their resumes, but a lot of people don't fully understand completely. So when we talk about facilitation, what are we talking about here?
I think it's a great question, and there's lots of ways to look at it, but at its root, and maybe it's my undergraduate degree in English, but when you break down the word facilitation, it's really facile and then actions. And so facile is to make easier. And so what facilitation is about is making it easier for the individuals being facilitated to have better discussions, make better decisions, produce better results if it's a planning session, to learn more if you're facilitating a workshop. And so taking that one core question, given the work that I'm doing and the people that I'm doing it with, how might it make it easier for them to express difficult opinions, to push the envelope on the ideas that they're willing to entertain, to share a contrary opinion that nobody else agrees with? That's the thing that's always running. It's like a constant message in the background of my brain of how might I make it easier for people to do the things that they want to do with each other.
That seems like a dangerous idea. I mean, it sounds like in concept, it sounds like it could be really good, and that's what we're aiming for. But I think that if there's one thing that we've seen over and over again, especially this year maybe, is that having uncomfortable discussions, people aren't necessarily that good at it. I mean, if there's one thing everyone's talking about, they're talking about divisiveness. They're talking about this inability to really communicate effectively because we just come up to this point where we stop communicating. So what role do you think facilitation plays, or maybe your role in teaching facilitation to others, that plays in a year like this one?
It's an excellent observation. And I think it's useful to always think about the fact that people in a group are going to have different levels of knowledge and experience and comfort with having more difficult conversations. So that's just a fact. Then we layer on that, what are the degrees of trust that are present or absent among the people who are in the group? Because if there's a low trust environment, it is going to be more difficult for people to sometimes speak their truth, or to hear somebody else's truth that they don't agree with at all, but yet hold it up and entertain it for a brief time period. So facilitation can help with that, both on the design of the session. You can, in your pre-surveying of people, in the preparation of the agenda, the materials that you provide, you can be gathering some of that to get a sense of what do I need to do to make this safe, if you want to use the analogy of safe space. That's pretty common. We talk about that. In recent years, we've talked more about brave spaces. That safe space sometimes allows people to just kind of be polite and say surface level things. And we really want brave spaces where people say, no, that's not right. And here's why I don't think that is right, even if they are the minority opinion that's speaking. So we've got the advanced part of it. And then there's also, obviously, when we're in the facilitation situation. So we can cultivate ground rules or shared agreements with the participants of this is how we're going to engage with each other. And then have a conversation around how are we going to hold each other accountable for this? Because one of the things that sometimes happens, and it's natural, but I don't think it's ideal, is we default to the facilitator, if there is a designated facilitator like myself, to be the enforcer. And I'm not the squad car on the side of the road with the speed gun aimed at you, ready to pull you over the minute you speed. They're not my rules. They're agreements that we just made with each other. And so I need to facilitate a conversation with the group of how are we going to hold each other accountable for this, so that it's not just me thinking about them. And then finally, and you hope that you don't have to do this a lot, but as a facilitator, I feel sometimes I'm the ombudsperson for the group. And so when somebody starts to get maybe a little hostile or aggressive in their tone, maybe a little disrespectful, it may be easier for me to say, hold on, we said we want to talk to each other in this tone. I'm going to invite you to rephrase that. That's particularly easier when you're an external facilitator. If you're the peer facilitator and you're, the board chair doing that with your colleagues, or you're the manager talking about your team in the office, that's got some power and hierarchy issues, but you can still do that, or someone peer-to-peer can do that if they reference back to those shared agreements, because that's stuff that we all said, we're going to hold ourselves accountable for that. That's not me interjecting my belief system on somebody else. That's me saying, we want to do and act in this manner, and it seems like we're shifting from that.
Yes. And I saw this come across earlier, and my dear friend, Sarah Grace, I'm so excited to see her. She's joining the conversation from Portland, Oregon. Look, and when we think about Portland too, a lot of these places have been hotbeds for a lot of activity this year, where there have been, again, heated arguments, protests, a lot of things have been going on. And I think that when people look at skilled facilitators, it's almost as if, if they know anything about facilitation at all, it's almost as if, oh, well, maybe that's for someone else and not for me. Like maybe I don't want to be in that role of facilitator, because that's a lot of responsibility having these tough discussions. Can anyone learn the skills of facilitation?
Absolutely. And my kind of standard stump speech on this is that anyone can and everyone should make facilitative contributions, because when there's a designated facilitator, I'm thinking all the time about what would make it easier for this group to do what we've convened together to do. But I'm just one person with my own perspective, my own assumptions, my own biases, and anyone in the group at any time may have an idea of, gosh, I wish Jeffrey would ask us to do X, or I wonder if he's going to have us do Y. If they don't feel comfortable speaking that, either because I haven't created that dynamic with them, or they don't perceive that they have the skills or the competence or the confidence to make that contribution, we lose that input. And we miss the opportunity to make things better in the moment. So I think everyone can. You have to be realistic about the level of skill that you have in relation to the type of conversation that you are agreeing to facilitate. I'm constantly working on my skill set, and there's baseline facilitation skills that kind of allow you to help move things along in general. But then certain types of environments, certain types of groups, certain types of conversations require a different skill set and some knowledge of tools and techniques that not everybody would have, particularly if they haven't been exposed to any formal facilitation training.
So that's an interesting point, because since I've known you, gosh, I guess over 10 years, I've known you. And over those years, I would have said that you were a master facilitator when I first heard you, but then, you're adding, 10 plus years to that, and the things that you've learned in between then and now. What are some of the significant ways that you think you've grown as a facilitator over the past 10 years?
That's a really good question. I've always had a high capacity for silence. I don't feel compelled when somebody asks me a question to respond immediately. I have no problem standing in front of a group, trying to figure out what I need to do next and having everybody kind of looking at me, waiting for me. But I do think I've deepened even that capacity, and I've become more intentional in not only being reflective about my own work in the moment and kind of checking my assumptions and thinking about alternatives, but holding groups in more of a reflective space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that is just we're all bombarded with so much information nowadays. And so groups kind of have a faster pace, a slightly more distracted level of awareness. Um, I'm the one person in the room as an external facilitator. I need to be 100% present.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to look at my phone. I'm not looking at email. I'm doing nothing but thinking about that group. And so I think that ends up being a gift that I've realized over the last decade or so is even more important. And then the other one, and this comes from, I've always had a facilitative approach to my workshops.
Mm-hmm.
They're short lecture segments, but there's usually a lot of interaction, engagement that honors both introverts and extroverts. I have become more aware in the last 10 years of, I make the distinction between content and people. If the people that I'm facilitating can raise on their own some of the content that I would otherwise present, like they already know some of this stuff,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to present that. I'm going to create some sort of an exercise, an activity that draws out of them and surfaces that content.
I'm there.
And then I can feel comfortable interjecting and adding to it the nuance that maybe they would not raise. And that I think is both, it's a security and a self-awareness that I don't need to have them think that I'm brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
I need to help them learn and realize that they're kind of brilliant on their own as well. And that's a shift that when I was a younger professional, I think, talking at people probably seemed like a more appropriate approach for whatever reason.
Oh, I wish that we could take all of our lessons that we learned and just, sort of bring them back to when we were younger and like hold on to them like that. Oh, I tell you, there are so many things that I would do differently. But as I look back and I think about some of the toughest discussions I've ever tried to lead, there have definitely been times when I approached it thinking, okay, I know the people who are going to be around the table. I know kind of, their arguments or the directions that things could go, the directions things could go in, where we could get sidetracked. And not all the time, but there would continue to be times. There might still continue to be times where no matter what kind of preparation I felt I had, the conversation moved beyond my facilitation skills. I'll say that. So when those things happen, when you end up in a situation where you begin to see that, whether it's one person being hung up on a particular argument, and the parking lot doesn't work, what are some of the approaches that you take to handle that?
So you were in a situation where a particular dynamic surfaced that you weren't quite confident in how to handle, or I just want to clarify.
Yeah, I think it was where there was a side discussion that was not necessarily relevant to what we were supposed to be solving at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But the emotions got so involved that people present felt that they needed to talk about that thing at that moment.
Yeah.
What wins? I mean, it's what wins.
Yeah. So
Yes.
a lot of what we can do as facilitators is just speak what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So, and check in with the group. So here's what I'm observing. I'm wondering what it means to you. So if somebody raises something and I think it's a tangent, for me to say, well, that's a tangent, let's move on. That's an authoritative declarative role. The only thing
Right.
somebody can do then is like, wait a minute, that's not a tangent. And they have to come back at me. I don't want to do that. That's my last resort to kind of play the because I said so. So what I can say is I'm wondering if this is what we most want to talk about right now.
Mm-hmm.
Stop. And then hold that space for somebody in the group to say, I'm not really sure it is. I recognize that Kiki's really passionate about this right now, but I'm not quite sure how this connects to what we were doing. And that kicks me back into facilitator mode of helping the group figure out, do we want to do something with this? And if so, what? Now, you added a layer to that I think is a really important one, is whenever there's a charged environment or emotion attached to something, it can be difficult for people to cognitively move on and let go if they're still passionate or emotional about something. And so sometimes the option that we want to present to the group or talk with them about is kind of that cathartic moment. I recognize there's some real intense feelings about this. It seems like the group is ready to move on, but I don't want us to do so until people who are really passionate about this have been able to get one last word in. So raise your hand if you want to just express yourself, or we're just going to clear the air, and we'll do that quickly, and then we'll pick up on our agenda. You can't, when I was a resident hall advisor in grad school, they said, never try to argue with the drunk residents. And I remember that, like you just, right then, you're there to take care of them, get them to bed, and then you come back the next day and talk about the inappropriate behavior. Kind of the same thing when there's that charged emotional environment in the group. That's what you have to most take care of, so that people feel like they've been heard, they've been attended to, they've been respected, and then you can steer it back into, quote, the real stuff.
Right.
But
Well,
it's difficult.
it is difficult, and it makes me admire all the more how effective and just, it really is an art to that skill that happens over time, I think, when you think about facilitation. Um, Another big issue that has come up, that has been an issue for a long time, but is something that we certainly saw come into the headlines in the forefront in 2020, is this idea of examining the social contract and exploring DEI issues, and really looking at, as a society, but then also as associations, as leaders, what are we doing, and how are we approaching, our programs? How are we approaching everything from our leadership? So, how do you see facilitation playing into what's happening related to DEI?
It's so critical, and I think anyone who has studied facilitation for any period of time would probably say that inclusion has always been a core principle or core value of facilitation, because you're always thinking about, how do I include the diverse perspectives that are present in the group? I think given the environment that we've been in now for maybe 5 to 10 years, and the deep passion and commitment that we have for equity and social justice, we have to look at every choice that we're making from a design standpoint and a facilitation standpoint, and filter them through a more expanded notion of inclusion. And I find myself looking at, the language that I use, the names that I use in my case studies. I just noticed this several months ago. Almost all the names that I use would be pretty stereotypical white folks. There just weren't names represented of people of color. And that was just an easy thing. But you have to look at everything. And as an English major, I was taught to proof for grammar, proof for tone, proof for wordiness. You have to add a DEI proof to all of your efforts and run that through. And maybe other people can do that in kind of a multitask way. I find that I need to do it specifically, look at the agenda, look at the activities, and run it through just the DEI filter to think about, for whom might I marginalize unintentionally by inviting them to participate in this way? Who am I excluding because of the language that I'm using? Have I asked the client, have I asked the participants the right questions to surface what some of their needs, interests, preferences are. I mean, a lot of people are challenged just to design for extroversion and introversion. Like if you only can get one right, I'd start there because that is going to be prevalent in every single group that you have. But you have to scale that up to become comfortable that what are you going to do when somebody in a group turns to another person and said, well, you're just playing the race card.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've had that happen. And I have to be cognizant of that moment of I'm accountable to the group. I'm accountable to the person who's being accused of that. I'm a middle-aged white guy. And so there's going to be how people perceive me and how I handle all of this. So there is definitely some inner work that we all need to do to build our own capacity around race, equity, and social justice, in addition to looking at the work that we're designing for other people, and are we doing that in a manner that reflects the values that we hope they'll associate with those efforts?
I think that is such an interesting approach to think about designing your communication for DEI, to be designing ahead of time for that. And it makes me wonder about the role of the facilitator in our new sort of remote workforce situation, where a lot of even organizations that never intended to really have leadership meetings or their employees working remotely have found, because of this pandemic, a situation in which they are exactly dealing with this remote workforce and remote communication. How hard is it as a facilitator to navigate through, uh, tough conversations over technology when you're not even in the same room and you can't necessarily pick up on all the nonverbal cues?
You just don't allow yourself to get hired for those. You just skip those.
So we'll just forget about facilitation for
Yeah,
now.
yeah. People
So
call and you say,
pause.
"Yeah, I'll pass."
Time out. Yeah.
I got to tell you, that's a question that's on my mind because my good friend Mike McCree talks a lot about getting practice reps.
Mm-hmm.
And my practice reps for managing that type of a conversation primarily are in the face-to-face. And I'm a big believer in the Kurt Lewin framework of behavior as a function of people interacting with their environment. The virtual environment causes people to interact differently. And you
Mm-hmm.
throw onto that a challenging topic, a difficult topic, a contentious issue. And that environment just isn't as conducive to it because we don't have some of the vocal tone nuances, the rhythm of our conversation is differently. The video quality, the sound quality. I mean, there's just so many variables for that. And so what I've been finding myself doing to help me get some of those practice reps is looking at what components do we need to do synchronous and all be online together, and how can I leverage offline asynchronous moments that allow for more individuality, more reflection, more thoughtful responses, and then aggregate that information in ways that we come together and discuss. So I'm trying to reduce the pressure or the heat
Mm-hmm.
on this conversation and move some of that off to collect the input, to make it more comfortable for people to maybe share anonymously some of their perspectives, aggregate that, promulgate it back out to everyone to look at in advance, and then convene the conversation. Because once that content has been generated by participants, once they've already said, even though it's anonymously, some of the stuff that's on their mind, not always, but in general, my experience has been people are better able to engage with it. But in the moment, when all of a sudden that comment comes at you,
Mm-hmm.
and we're all here with a little box on a screen, it just doesn't feel good, or it doesn't feel like you're equipped to respond to it as well as you would like. And particularly for people who are more introverted or reflective folks, it really does disenfranchise them in that conversation.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I think has come up pretty regularly is a lot of people and I say a lot of people, it's a lot of the people in the circle that I play in, I'll say, that I've seen online. They will post things like, this is great for introverts. This time is fantastic for introverts because they get to be away from people and working from home. And, and I think it's kind of wrong because it's not true for everyone. And I think that communication wise, it's a struggle for a lot of people who need to have important conversations and just simply can't do that in person now when that's always been an option for many of them before. And so I think that, and I don't know really where I'm going with this, but I just think talking about the introvert extrovert thing, I think that a lot of people are also dealing with some misinformation or misunderstandings about what those types of individuals, how they're doing in a time like this, because I think everyone's struggling in different ways.
It's easy to overgeneralize introversion and extroversion, and
Mhm.
each of us maybe has a general tendency in one of those areas, but it also varies on the moment, right? What
Yeah.
group am I with? What's the nature of that group? How familiar am I with them? What else is going on in my life? For somebody, if someone is very introverted and they've been at a conference all day and they've been extroverting all day, and you get them at the end of their day, they probably want to go recharge their battery. They
Yeah.
don't have much left to give you. If you got them early in the day, though, they're going to be very different. It's a different capacity. So I think you're right. And one of the things that we can do, you pose the question to me as the facilitator. One of the things that we can do, though, is say, this isn't just my problem or an issue that I need to deal with as a facilitator. It's really the groups.
Hmm.
They are going to be in this conversation. So the facilitative thing to do is engage the group in figuring this out. And I structure that conversation. I structure the survey questions. I frame the discussion around that of, given the issue that we are going to talk about next week and the environment in which we're going to do it, what do we need to do collectively? What do you need to do individually? And what contribution do you need me to make so that that is a easier conversation for us to have, and we produce a result that you can have some ownership over versus feeling like, well, we spent an hour and we got nowhere.
Right.
I'll have ideas, you know,
Yeah.
they'll have ideas as well. And if nothing else, just asking that, I think, demonstrates respect for the group, and that you're not there to inflict your tool or technique on them randomly. You're there in service of them and you want to be helpful. And that, I think, is as true if you're an internal facilitator, peer to peer with colleagues, as it is for me as an external facilitator. It's a service role. We're in service of the group and helping the group be successful. The group doesn't exist to make my life easier.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
they should.
Why can't they? I don't
Right.
know. I mean, while you're here.
Yeah.
So I do want to say, I want to bring up some of the voices that have been making comments along the way. We have Reed, who said, love brave spaces, when we were talking about brave spaces before.
If
And
you
so,
Google that phrase, brave spaces, it'll pop up a really good resource article that's out there. It's one of the first Google search results.
oh, I love that. And by the way, everyone, we have a listing of Jeffrey's best, his favorite resources for facilitation that I'm not only going to bring up to on the screen in a little bit, but I'm also going to, if you registered at the Eventbrite link, I'm going to send that out to all of you who registered at the Eventbrite link, and I will link to it in the show notes after I post the replay later, but I just have to upload that later. So look for that if you're really interested in those resources, and he has some good ones. Howard says, as Abby Hoffman once said, an expert is simply someone from out of town. And so isn't that true? Sometimes it's just, any other voice that is able to come in that hasn't already been dismissed would work.
Well, and I'll yes and that and add that the expertise in the conversation we're having today is not about the content of what people
Mhm.
are talking about, it's the process.
Right.
So when I go in to facilitate a group of engineers who have to make a decision in their association about, what's the best um, strategic directive that we want to make in order to provide more value to our members, I don't need to understand what engineers value. I need to understand how engineers talk and think and engage with each other and the implications that has for me structuring the conversation, the prep materials that we work through, what the agenda looks like, and my facilitation efforts. So when you make a commitment to become a facilitator, our expertise becomes about process and the
Mm.
design. It's not, that's our content. It's not the content of the group that we're going to be facilitating. That's their stuff that they bring into the conversation, and that we invite them to do that in the most meaningful and significant ways.
So I'm going to shift this now to asking you a little bit about the why for what you're focusing on now. Idea Architects was your baby for years,
Yeah.
and yet there's been a purposeful shift into this direction of doing facilitate better. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about that shift and about why it is that you feel like you need to focus on this now.
Yeah, I I appreciate that. There's kind of a multifaceted reasons for it. One consistent theme. So my roots are in higher education. I started doing leadership development on the college campus. Went into first an education director role with an association, then an executive director of two groups, and then have been consulting and writing and speaking for about 20 years now. The thread, the through line in all of those professional environments and positions is presentation and facilitation.
Mhm.
When you're in higher ed, you publish and you present. It's what you do, in order to be a good professional. And so, from a very early age and an early stage in my professional career, I understood the importance of being able to effectively manage group process, not only in doing workshops or running meetings, but in my supervisory relationships with direct reports, with clients now. And so the notion and the value of bringing a facilitative mindset and approach into all these different interactions, um, I found makes life much easier, and I've been able to be more effective. Short of when I try to facilitate my friends deciding where to go out for dinner, and they're like, dude, we did not hire you here.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
always worried I'm going to flip chart options and make them dot vote.
Okay, so Ty goes in the parking lot. We're gonna talk about
Exactly.
something else.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
So as
Oh,
the
go ahead.
pandemic kind of inspired some reflection, and I thought, what would, if I was going to focus, what would I really focus on? And I decided it was facilitation skills. And I went back and I looked at client work for the last 20 years, and some aspect of facilitation, and then
Mhm.
also direct facilitation training, particularly for staff and for volunteer leaders, has been anywhere from a quarter to a third of my portfolio in any given year. So that says to me that people already value to some degree my thinking on facilitation, my approach to teaching it to other people. And ultimately, I just believe deeply that people who can facilitate are going to be more successful in their interpersonal relationships and their organizational contributions. And in my dream, so many people get so much better at doing that I at least work myself out of a job. I'm sure other facilitators would prefer to still get hired, but that there's a base level of competence and confidence in organizations that when you do bring in an outside facilitator, it's for higher order, more difficult situations. You're really drawing on the very best of our unique skill set and contributions versus a routine planning meeting that I don't want to say I can do them in my sleep, but they're so fundamental and basic at this stage of my professional career. And I think you should be able to do this yourself. And
Mhm.
now I want to help people do that.
See, and I know you, and I know that you absolutely mean that. For a lot of people, they might say something like that, and you're like, yeah, yeah, that's good, but they're going to keep on. I know you, and I know that's actually your goal, is to make sure that you just work yourself right out of needing to do it anymore. It's
Yeah.
amazing. So, okay, so I'm going to try something new that I've never done before, and I'm so excited. This is going to be a lightning round for association chat, and I have to thank Jeffrey for the idea, because I haven't actually done a lightning round on association chat before, but he asked me if I was going to offer one, and I said, "Sure, yeah,
Yeah,
I
why not?
am. Yeah, we are now." So here we go. Do you feel ready? Do you feel ready for this moment?
I do, because I'm going to think of it as a lightning bolt of inspiration is going to come at each thing you pose to me during this round. So I'm ready to be struck by those thunderbolts.
All right. So, and then I have a handy bell that's going to help us along the way. So, do you hear that? Did it go
I
through?
do. Excellent.
All right. Excellent. Um, okay. So, the first one, that we'll start with a softball, an experience that really shaped who you are as a person and or professional. Eh,
Yeah. It was when I was in college. I was getting ready to start my freshman year in college, and I was a waiter at a small restaurant chain in Northern Illinois. They came in, they gave me the DISC personal profile one week and said, "We're just doing this with some select staff people." And I was like, "Oh, sure, whatever." They came back the next week, they interpreted my results, and then they asked me to be a district manager in charge of $5 million in restaurant sales while I went to school.
Oh my gosh.
And my mouth kind of did what you did. And I was like, I don't know anything about managing a restaurant. And I said, that test, that thing told you that you should do this? And they said, no, it was just the confirmation of what we've seen in you. So I went to school full time, 2 days a week, carrying a full load. And then 5 days a week, I was a district manager, overseeing managers of restaurants that were in their 40s, their 50s. And remember, I'm an 18-year-old kid.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
so all of that just shapes so much, and probably, has informed some of my facilitation. I don't even realize that I had no credibility, and I had to build relationships, and I had to be willing to be vulnerable in front of people that technically they reported to me, and then juggling just an ungodly schedule on a weekly basis. And I was able to keep it up for about 2 years, and then I had to scale back and play student full time more.
All right. I don't know when the bell goes. I have to figure this out. Okay. So, your original career aspiration or job?
Vice president for student affairs at a large public university. I was working my way towards that, was working on my doctorate, got recruited for a unique position in the first association. I viewed it as a 2-year detour to come to Indianapolis, work in this group, and got the job because I'd been a volunteer with the group. And 25 years later, I'm not a vice president for student affairs.
No, you're not. No, you're not. But okay. Next question. What's your Myers-Briggs?
ENTJ, low on the T and low on the E, off the scale on the N. Very intuitive. Detail work, I can do it, but I really, really have to focus on it. And then I have a pretty strong J. I like to bring closure, which is interesting because when you facilitate, closure is a very different dynamic. So I've learned to keep that in check, I hope, when I'm doing client work.
Okay. An example, you're doing great, by the way.
Okay.
An example of how luck or timing has helped or hindered you.
Luck or timing has helped or hindered me. I don't know if this is true. Only Marcia Ray, who used to be the vice president of the foundation at ASAE, she would be the only one who could confirm this. And even though we see each other, we used to see each other regularly, I've never asked her this, but the first time I spoke at ASAE annual meeting, it was at the Marriott Wardman Park. Is that what it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think let's go with that.
Yeah,
We'll
yeah,
say yes.
the big Marriott.
Sure.
And I was just doing a session on designing interactive workshops. I was in a big room, but it was packed. There was standing room, so it was overflowing. She happened to walk by. She helped get some more chairs, and then she hung around for a little while. She was director of education at ASA at this time. About a year later, I got asked to do the Future Leaders Conference, and Marcia was the one who asked me to do that. I have to think that the luck of her being the one in my room looking at like, who is this guy? We don't know him. There are a lot of people here. He seems to kind of be okay knowing what he talks about. And then future leaders, the gift of being able to do that for 10 years and work with the fellows. And it's one of those things that you could never make happen, and it would be totally inappropriate to try to make happen. So I always feel like that was just a luck of the Irish.
All right. Are you Irish?
No.
Next question. A few adjectives people who know you best might use to describe you.
If they wanted to be positive, they would say thoughtful. If they were being a little more critical, they would probably move it over into high maintenance. I don't think
is that true?
It is, which I don't see myself that way. But when it comes to my work, the integrity of choices is really important to me, and I think that's what distinguishes an amazing learning experience from a pretty good one. Is when you've thought everything through. So, I mean, I want to know when I'm talking to clients, I want to know, what are you serving for lunch? How is it being served? In what portions? Is it a 60-inch round table or a 72-inch round table? Because I know, because of having been a meeting planner and a director of education, that all of those choices are going to make a difference in the feel for the event. Sometimes that attention to detail and that thoughtfulness creeps into my interpersonal relations, and that's where it crosses over a little bit into high maintenance. The other one that would probably come up with most everybody is they would say that I'm a contradiction or an enigma, in the sense that the perception that people have of me isn't really what I'm all about in some cases. And the easiest example is people think that I'm incredibly extroverted and outgoing and gregarious. Not at all. I am really good once I make a connection with somebody. If somebody introduces me to a stranger, I'm good. Walk up to a stranger and just start conversation, I don't do that. But because of being a keynote speaker and all that, people see you in action and they think, oh, that's who you are. And it's not. It's who I am in that moment, because that's a role that I'm performing. And I think there's a lot of contradictions that in my persona that surface only to a small group of people who really get to know me well. And then people would say that I'm curious, because I'm always curious.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Well, so you're curious. That's one of that's you're not curious like, oh, Jeffrey is curious.
Yeah, I'm curious about, I'm interested and curious and open to learning, to talking about anything with anybody about at any time. So I'm always surprised by little moments of inspiration or learning that come just by me saying, yeah, I'm going to hang out and watch this video, or I'm going to talk to this person on the plane that I really don't want to talk to, but they seem like they want to talk, so I'll go for the ride for a while.
What is a regular source of inspiration for you?
Kids, particularly in the, I would say, age 2 or 3 up until about 6 or 7. I don't have any kids. I used to volunteer with 2nd and 3rd graders, but the pandemic has disrupted that. But the neighbor kids in particular, and their open-mindedness, their curiosity, their playfulness, and honestly, the thing that really stands out for me from kids that age is the kindness. There's a purity of that it inspires me to remember that as adults, that may not be as natural to us as it once was, but I can always choose the kind option. I can always choose to be generous. And quite honestly, as somebody who is in a much more privileged position than a lot of people, I should make that choice. It's ridiculous for me to make the selfish choice most of the time.
Last question. What is one book that you would recommend almost everyone read?
When I started my first consulting practice, Like-Minded People, with Karen Nishimura-Sneath, who is fairly well known in the association community, I think it was the first year of our practice, I went to the Sundance Resort, Robert Redford's resort, for a workshop that was organized by Margaret Wheatley, Meg Wheatley, she's known more as. The physicist Fritjof Capra was there, and Dee Hock, who was the chairman of VISA, and it was about self-organizing systems, which is a really fancy way of saying that much of what we do in organizations is too mechanistic, and that if we look to biology and ecology, we would learn a lot from that. Meg wrote a book called Leadership in the New Science. It really made those scientific distinctions. It's a little heady. So the follow-up book to that is called A Simpler Way, and it's by Meg Wheatley and her colleague at the time, Myron Kellner Rogers. It's a beautiful book. Meg and I share an attention to detail and high maintenance on publications, and that the paper stock just feels good. I'm sure her publisher threw a fit because it probably cost a lot more. It is one of the most calming explanations of how organizations and life really can function simpler. They don't require as many controls as we try to put in play. People are more willing to take initiative if we undo some of the systems that we've put around them to kind of carrot and stick their way into appropriate behavior. And it's one of the few books that I reread every year.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And I'm bringing over a few comments I saw come in. Brian says, I notice I become better at a skill or topic when I have to train or facilitate. Sharon says, great interview with Jeff.
Sharon.
And Reed's back, and he says, really awesome discussion. Yes, thank you, Reed. Really appreciate that. Thank you, by the way, for being my guinea pig in the lightning round. How was that?
I love the lightning round. Yeah. It's kind of fun because if you thought longer, you wouldn't necessarily generate better responses.
I totally agree. And I was really curious what your book response was going to be, because over the years, you've shared some really great books with me. And so I was like, ooh, what is this going to end up being? Okay. So, we're wrapping up our discussion, and I want to make sure that people understand a little bit more about, facilitate better and the things that you're doing now, because especially since facilitation, a lot of people are looking for how they can boost their skills and what they can do to sort of prepare themselves to either be more valuable in the job that they have, or maybe even try to expand and grow beyond where they are. What is it how is it that people can get more engaged and learn more about working with you?
Appreciate the opportunity to do blatant self-promotion, which I'm never.
This is that moment.
It is, and I appreciate, because I'm never comfortable doing it. I always feel like your work is your best self-promotion. But so it's an evolving portfolio. So let me tell you what I've got committed to right now, and I'm going to evolve based on what people tell me would be useful. I think the thing that I think is probably most approachable for everybody is, starting the week of Thanksgiving, I'll launch a Substack newsletter, and it is going to be completely free through the end of the year. And I'm going to be exploring each week one principle, practice, some key aspect of facilitation. Once a month, I'm going to share a favorite learning format, tool, or technique, and provide kind of a train-the-trainer outline of how you use that with specific steps, suggested phrasing that you use to introduce it to a group, and some sample slides. So people should feel pretty equipped to adopt it outright or adapt it. Every other week, I'm going to take a how can I X situation. So how can I get a group in which nobody's participating to better engage? And I'll kind of run through all that. So that's free through the end of the year. And then starting in 2021, there'll be a free option, and there'll be some paid options that get the more substantive content. I'm going to, I think, I'm still kind of exploring. Facilitation, I think, is better taught in person, but that still looks like we're not going to have a lot of those opportunities in 2021. So I've been working with an online platform, and I'm looking at probably creating 2, maybe 3 online on-demand facilitation courses for different skill sets that would be kind of like the masterclass courses, where you watch some video, there's a learning workbook, you can start and stop, go at your own pace. I have been doing some courses like that for associations, and particularly for chapter leaders, live webinars. And then the Last thing, when we do have face-to-face trainings, is I would be happy to custom design some powerful learning experiences. I think when you're talking about developing facilitation skills, you're looking at least a half day, a full day is better. It just doesn't fit in the breakout session format, although you can do a very quick nuts and bolts in 60 minutes if that's all there is, but it definitely is not ideal. So those are the key things right now. I appreciate you letting me share those.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time today to be a part of this discussion, for letting me interview you, and for being my guinea pig through my very first lightning round of questions that I've ever done on Association Chat in 11 years of asking people questions. I
11
haven't
years. Wow.
11 years I haven't done a lightning round, if you can believe it. So thank you for doing all of that, and for just continuing to inspire me. I really
Well,
appreciate it.
and thank you, Kiki. I'm not sure newcomers appreciate how long you've been making such generous contributions to the association community. I mean, Association Chat in its infancy, you you saw the need, you created an opportunity to really expand this into the substantive conversations, the quality of the content on the site, and the different things that you do. So I know you plugged your Patreon on the front end, but I hope people will take advantage of that because we all give and contribute in ways that we find meaningful because we want this community to grow and to flourish, and that's part of being a good professional. But it's nice when we can also provide compensation to our colleagues who are really going above and beyond. And that's why it was an easy yes for me to say, talk with you about facilitation, sign me up.
I'm feeling hot, and I'm like, oh. Well, I want to thank you so much, and I'm going to say bye, Jeffrey. Bye,
Bye.
bye, and thanks to all of you. Honestly, having Jeffrey on this week, talking about facilitation, talking with all of you, I think that this is such an important time to have discussions like this when we are trying to figure out better ways to bring people around the table to, whether it's literal or figurative, to discuss important things, to be able to disagree and agree, to get to a point where we can solve problems together. I mean, that is what we're all really trying to do, isn't it? So thank you very much. I hope you learned something today. And until next time, everyone, keep learning every day and keep asking questions. As Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Have a great week, everyone.